Hello, everyone. My name is Trey Mangum. I am the managing editor of Blavity.com and Shadow and Act. And before we get started, I want to briefly thank the Writers Guild Foundation for hosting this conversation. This May marks the 70th anniversary of the landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which was a major victory for the civil rights movement. But this historic case was the basis for Separate But Equal, the 1991 miniseries starring Sidney Poitier, Burt Lancaster, and winner of the Emmy for Outstanding Miniseries. Joining us today is the executive producer, writer, director of Separate But Equal, George Stevens Jr. George has achieved an extraordinary creative legacy spanning over 50 years. Thank you for joining us today, George.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here to talk about this film and this event.
Yes, of course, of course. This is the 70th anniversary of the decision, and it's being re-released by Paramount Home Entertainment on DVD. So I'm so excited. This is such a timely conversation to have, and just, celebratory of this moment in history to also reflect on your impactful miniseries as well. So before we get started into talking specifically about Separate But Equal, I kind of just want to talk about the relevance of the Brown versus Board of Education decision just in general. The miniseries was released in 1991. I was born in 1992, so I wasn't too far removed from when this miniseries was released. But one thing I like to think about is the fact that this decision reverberates and just remains timely over time. And, the decision was made in 1954, of course, but, I'm someone who's from rural North Carolina. And, sometimes those decisions like that take a long time to, take effect. My parents were born in the 50s. My mom was actually born in 1954 when the decision was made. And yet, she was not in a integrated classroom until her sophomore year of high school around 69, 70. So that just goes to show like when decisions are made like that, sometimes it takes a while. And then even in 2024, we still see like even though we have court decisions, we have laws, we have things such as, gentrification, redlining, et cetera, that still, have some of these issues that are still prevalent today. So for you, the fact that this decision was in 1954, the fact that the series came in 1991, how do you think this miniseries still proves that though we have come a long way, we still have a certain amount of time to go as well?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I watched it Separate But Equal on Friday night with my wife. And it was interesting because I had not seen the complete film since the time of its release.
Mhm.
And I like to think that it is one of those that stands the test of time because the ideas remain so current. And in the discussion in the latter part of the story, in the conference of the 9 justices, and they are trying to find their way to a decision. And the Chief Justice, Earl Warren, wants a unanimous decision. He feels that a 5-4 decision, it would be inadequate, that the country needs this to be a very strong statement. And when you think, for the background, most of our Writers Guild members know this, but it was in 1896 that the Supreme Court passed Plessy versus Ferguson, which was argued on the basis of the 14th Amendment, but the decision stated that if facilities were equal, it was all right to have facilities segregated by race. And that law stood until 1954 for over half a century. And so to see this today where we still have work to do, it's very interesting that it is a subject that will remain at the forefront, really, of our of our obligations.
Yes, yes. And it's interesting because as I was taking a rewatch at the miniseries, how it even it begins because it's the first this it's like a trickle down effect, the first is when we first see in the movie, in the series, and it's about busing. It's a thing about busing, kids who have to walk miles to school and having that same opportunity. And like, busing is something that's come up, like especially I'm going to reference being from the South, but just knowing how that dialogue about, having schools become equal, just by the base of like where you live and the opportunity. And it's interesting again that so many years later, um, we kind of have, similar, like busing is still a thing in certain communities, and the question to bus or not to bus. And I think that it just shows how it also shows how film and movie making and TV making can also be like a relic of the time as well. Like how you can actually see in history, like, okay, we did this series based upon what happened, and years later you can still look at that series and still have points of like where we can go today. So that's super fascinating to me.
Yes, and the reference to busing, as you refer to it, of course, predates the what became called busing.
Mhm.
Um, but Thurgood Marshall was looking for a case to take to the Supreme Court. Um, and he found this case in Charleston, South Carolina, a little town called Clarendon, in which there was what Thurgood called doghouse schools. These separate schools, which were just so poor, and the facilities were so vastly different than. And we have the Scotts Branch School, which was the actual school where Harry Briggs Jr., a little boy, would walk 5 miles every day to the Scotts Branch School on dusty roads and walk home again at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And after that first day, we see these children in the school, and they take their pledge of allegiance to the flag, and they're like all other American school children of the day, except they are in this particularly segregated school. And I'm always fond of show me, don't tell me in film. And
Yeah.
when Harry Briggs leaves the school and heads down the road, and first one yellow school bus comes by and covers him in dust, and then another. And it really was a metaphor for the story that we're about to see.
Yeah.
It's uh, worth thinking and remembering that the people with Thurgood Marshall came to their church, talked to them, and asked them if they would gather a petition um, and file a case. He would argue the case for the people of Scott's Branch. Uh, and that the bravery that was necessary and the retribution that was Harry Briggs's father had served in the Navy in World War II, and it
Mhm.
made him. He said, I didn't spend 2 years in the Army fighting to save Jim Crow,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and he lost his job as a result of having his name on the case. And the reverend who ran the school, his house was burned down, and so the people had to put themselves on the line, and the lawyers who argued the case, including Thurgood Marshall, were subject to a great deal of danger. Uh,
Mhm.
uh, and and you had the Ku Klux Klan, and uh, there was a lot of risk involved.
Yeah. I was thinking about how like, it's like you're kind of putting yourself, I can only imagine them at the time putting themselves like in the line of fire just to be even associated with it. It's like, do you want better for your family, you want better for your kids, but it's like, are you bringing more trouble by just even even wanting to be a part of it. And I saw that in the scenes of, they just want their child to have the same education that everyone else did. But then you're even met with sometimes hesitancy even from people in your own community, just because they're like, okay, how is this gonna affect? This is gonna, like, bring more danger to us. And I think that that's something for me. I think that's something you think about nowadays as well, because it's like it's one thing to sometimes upholding the status quo can be quite comfortable. But it's like upending that status quo that's uncomfortable. And I think that's one thing that's clearly present in the retelling of the story, the miniseries.
Yes, and it probably worth saying for our audience, because many of us know Brown versus the Board of Education, the title of the case, and Brown was the name of a little girl in Kansas. But there were 5 cases that went to the Supreme Court,
Mhm.
and I think the most interesting one and was the Clarendon County case, and that is the story we tell
Mhm.
in the film.
Yes. And I want to touch a little bit on, of course, you're such a iconic filmmaker, and your father also did so many things, and both of you contributed so much to kind of what we know today to be American cinema. I wanted to know, at the time that this miniseries was made, and I guess factoring in like your own upbringing and influence on the project as well. How did all of this factor into you wanting to take on this project as writer and director? But also at the time, how do you think this project was kind of encompassing and kind of evident of the work that you wanted to do as a filmmaker?
Well, thank you for that question. And I'm sure that if my fellow members of the Writers Guild know how difficult it is to mount a social justice film on commercial television. So uh, I, I used to produce, originated the AFI Life Achievement Award. And when David Lean came to receive the Life Achievement Award, we were having a conversation, and he said, the hardest part of making a film is finding a story you fall in love with.
Mm,
And I became acquainted with this Clarendon County story, and I just fell in love with it. And I thought it had the opportunity to really tell the complexity of separate but equal, and how this made its way to the court. Uh, and I grew up with a wonderful father who was very interested in social justice, and it showed up in many of his films, notably Giant and The Diary of Anne Frank and
mhm,
others. And I worked with him on The Diary of Anne Frank and Giant. And I was drawn to opportunities not to preach, but to find a story that will enlighten people in a way, and hopefully move them and make them think. Uh, so I set out to do this, and just the story of how it came about. I went to CBS. Some people will remember a very fine executive at CBS named William Self. And I had worked on the story, and I had an idea how to tell it. And I sat in his office, and I told him the shape of the story. And
mhm,
he said, God, well, that's a wonderful story. And uh, he says, but you can't cast it for television. How would you cast it? And I said, well, I mean, Sidney Poitier comes to mind. And he smiled ruefully and said, we have been to Sydney at least once a year for the last 15 years, but Sydney does not do television. And then he said, if you come and tell me that Sidney will read a script, we will pay for the script. So he put me in that position, and I went to see Sidney. Sidney had been vice chairman of the board when we founded the American Film Institute. And
Mhm.
actually, we'd been acquainted before that. And I went up to his house and we sat down, just the two of us, and I told him this story. And I said, I want to make this, I want to film it, but it's too long for a movie, and it needs time
Mhm.
to deal with all the aspects of it. And I said, I understand you don't do television, but and Sidney had a kind of princely way of he looked at me and he said very precisely, if you come with a compelling script on this story, I will do it. And so I was at once exhilarated, and then driving back down to the Beverly Hills Hotel, I realized I'd sentenced myself. And it happened that the Writers Guild strike started 2 weeks after this,
Mhm.
which meant that I could not go back to CBS. But as a writer, I could write my own original material. So
Mhm.
I spent the summer writing the screenplay, separate but equal, and sent it to Sidney. And I received a call from his agent, Marty Baum. Uh, and Marty Baum says, I don't know what you've written, but this man wants to do it. And that was Marty's beginning of a negotiation for Sidney
Mhm.
to star in the film. And and that really, I mean, first of all, it inspired me. And at the time, I was doing the Kennedy Center Honors, and we were sponsored by General Motors entirely. It was their Mark of Excellence program. And I went to Detroit and met with my colleagues that I knew from General Motors and told them the story and gave them the script and mentioned the name of, of a fine actor, Sidney. And we went right ahead and made a deal with ABC. And I was also interested in directing the film. And I had not been directing since I had gone to Washington and founded the AFI. And I
Mhm.
had, in my 20s, directed Alfred Hitchcock and Peter Gunn and things of that sort. And Sidney was very comfortable with me directing it, which I don't know if it made ABC comfortable, but it made them agree to do it. And so we were set up in a way to make the film that we wanted to make and to have the time to tell the story.
Yes, yes. It seems hearing you tell that story, it seems like you were able to, I would say, like see a vision, the vision that you had for it through, like see it through to the end. But as you mentioned earlier, like as and some of the writers will probably be able to resonate with this. It's hard to mount a pick about social justice. That's something that's
Mhm.
kind of like remained the same thing in the years following. Even now, so many writers will you say like they may they may get pressure to sanitize sometimes their scripts, or they may have to like introduce certain characters that may not completely be historical to what's at hand. Like that's something that's still kind of a trap that sometimes writers may get into when trying to present a story. Did you face any of that when developing this? And then also maybe what's even some sort of advice you would give to writers attempting to do social justice projects that are similar in this vein?
You always get a little of that, but I must say the script was really in good shape,
Mm,
and the network agreed with that. And I don't believe they've had any suggestions that in any way compromised or diminished it. And again, that's having an individual like Sidney involved, uh, suddenly they had more respect than they might have otherwise for a project.
Yeah, yeah. And because this is being it's going to be out on DVD again in honor of this anniversary, I was doing some digging. I was trying to find some reviews and just like recaps reviews that came out at the time when this was first released, and it's something that I've been thinking about myself as well about how this project kind of exists as part of, it's this piece of history. It's this piece of history. And it could be something that's like a docuseries, but we're having the scripted telling of it. But at the same time, while it serves as this history, it's also just it's a courtroom drama at the same time. Like it's like you're watching both history, but also this really really good kind of like the basics of what you need to do if you're creating if you're crafting a courtroom drama at the same time. How is it like, I guess, balancing both the historical element of this, but also creating just a really strong courtroom drama that can be a courtroom drama even outside of the history that's being presented?
Well, yeah, I would just say that the effort was with the entire piece because the Supreme Court doesn't come into it until the second part.
Mhm.
Uh, but to find the drama in it and to find the conflict um, in this idea of separate but equal, and just the idea of states' rights and segregation. And I think the viewer, in viewing it recently, as I said with my wife, uh,
Mhm.
that we make very strong arguments for the other side. That was the weight of opinion was on that side, and that's for the states to decide. And as the great lawyer, if Sidney that Thurgood would face in the Supreme Court, John W. Davis, who was generally known as America's greatest lawyer. He tried more cases in the Supreme Court than anyone else.
Wow.
He had been the Democratic nominee for president in the late 20s. I mean, he was this great figure of a man. The Davis Polk law firm still carries his name. And so that he would frame this legal argument in a very persuasive way. And we were, I think, able to engage the audience. Interesting about casting, we have a wonderful cast in Separate but Equal, and so many extraordinary actors, including, rather interestingly, Jeffrey Wright, who
Yes,
has
yes.
had so much success in this year. It was Jeffrey's first role. He was a 25-year-old. He had just graduated or from, he'd been at St. Albans School in Washington and had graduated. I think he was 25 when he did it, and it was his first role. And he played William Coleman, one of the lawyers. But in framing it, the John W. Davis part, I was interviewing actors, and there are a lot of very fine, fine actors. Davis was, I think, at least in his early 70s when he
Mhm.
tried the case. Uh, but I did have this feeling that if I have an unknown actor playing Davis and Sidney Poitier playing Thurgood Marshall, the audience is going to have a clue.
Mhm.
And and when I was already in South Carolina, worrying about casting that part, and I wrote to Burt Lancaster, who I was acquainted with, and it's obviously the smaller part, um, obviously going to be paid less money,
Mhm.
and I got a call from Bert's agent, Ben Benjamin, said, Bert received your script. He wants to do it. And it just gave such a lift, that you have actors of equal stature
Yeah.
on either side of the courtroom part of the case.
Mhm. Yeah, and I thought that was just like so interesting that we're having this anniversary of this and have this release coming out. And it's coming out during a year where Jeffrey Wright is having so much success, and not only success, but he's having success in a film that, is very, it pushes where we're at in the political climate. It kind of pushes at a lot of the notions that we have. So it's just interesting the timing of all of this. It's kind of like serendipitous, so to speak. But that's really interesting to know. And the casting part is also interesting as well, because you have, like you said, you have, two heavyweights really coming from, their respective, coming from the industry, and being able to co-sign a project like this, that is a television project at that. And you've kind of spoken about this a little bit before, but I want to talk more about the idea of this being a mini series versus a feature film. Was there any version of this project that was a feature film and you decided, okay, it needs to be a mini series, and just kind of like the process of knowing and implementing, like, this has to be told in two parts, this has to be told in this format as opposed to a film?
I had just previously made a miniseries called "The Murder of Mary Fagan," which I
Mm,
wrote with Jeffrey Lane and Larry McMurtry. Um, and it won the Emmy for the best miniseries. It starred Jack Lemmon. So I was kind of comfortable in that area. And I really did feel that to tell this story, you needed time. And
mhm.
to be half as long um, would not have given you that opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, like, it's also, like you said, to be able to nab, some actors who may have been used to, have may not have been like as TV friendly. I feel like it's having a resurgence now, because before I felt like it was, I guess, like in the 2000s, it was, and probably 2010s, like it was kind of you didn't see a lot of you didn't see a lot of movie star actors doing TV, but now they're slowly doing a lot more TV now. So that's kind of indicative of that coming back in time as well. But and you spoke about a bit about the cast as well, but was the cast something that you thought about when developing the project? Was it something you kind of, like, as it got down to the wire of the actual casting, you thought more about? What was it like being able to put together um such a ensemble that we see, and then having, like you said, having to, you spoke earlier about, the executive saying, like, how is this, is this castable, like, from that aspect. So what was it like being able to implement that vision, making sure that that casting would ensure the success and green light of this all?
Well, I did the casting in New York, and there was a casting director named Alix Gordon, and she was very good. She'd worked with Alan Pakula, and he'd recommended her.
Mhm.
Um, and she did a wonderful job of bringing in fine actors, and many that I'd not heard of or was not acquainted with. And I'm just looking at it again. I'm happy with every actor in the
Mhm.
piece. Um, and Cleavon Little, Albert Hall, uh, Lynn Stovall, uh, just wonderful actors and actresses. I guess we refer to them all as actors. Um, and then Richard Kiley, who came on board to play Earl Warren. But people read the script and they really were excited by it. And people, when they came in to read for parts, they really sensed the value of it. So we had very good luck and good fortune in casting.
And we talked a bit about social justice filmmaking, and I think that's something that, like, it kind of never really goes. Um, it's never really not topical to make films about the state of politics, whether whichever period of time we're in, whichever like era we're in, it seems something that always comes up. We've even seen already projects made about, things that we went through around the pandemic. Like there are already, projects about that. But for you, what do you think personally is the most fulfilling aspect to be able to translate historical events into projects such as this that can not only exist forever, but projects that also may be able to introduce these things to a new generation. For example, like, this is something that didn't even come out when I was born, but I'm able to like look at it and and it also informs other generations as well. So what's the most fulfilling aspect about that as you from a filmmaker's perspective?
I'll tell you a story. uh, I went to the 1952 Academy Awards with my father, George Stevens,
Mhm.
um, and sat next to him. And uh, when a certain time came in the show, Joseph L. Mankiewicz came on the stage, a great writer and director, who had won the Oscar for directing from the year before for All About Eve, and actually the Oscar for writing as well. And Mankiewicz came to the stage and said, the nominees are uh, John Huston for The African Queen, William Wyler for Detective Story, Vincent Minnelli for An American in Paris, Elia Kazan for A Streetcar Named Desire, and George Stevens for A Place in the Sun, my father's film with Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift and Shelley Winters.
Mhm.
Well, I would not be telling you the story had John Huston won that night, but my father won his first Oscar. But driving home that night, the Oscar was he was driving the car, and the Oscar was on the seat between us. And he looked, I must have been about 18, and he
Mhm.
looked over and he said, we will have a better idea what kind of a movie this is in about 25 years.
Mm.
This was before DVDs, before streaming. Pictures came and went, but he had this sense of the test of time. And it's totally influenced me. And it's what interests me most about films are the films that last and maintain their validity. And, it's thrilling for me to hear that somebody who was not born when this film was made discovers it and finds something in it. So yes, the test of time is very important.
Absolutely, absolutely. And switching gears a little bit, you have a memoir that I got to take a little look at that, recounts just so many things about your journey and your filmmaking and all of that. I wanted to ask, like, why do you think for you, like, why was the time now for a memoir? And then, like, as far as scope, was there any stories or any narratives or any parts of as far as your journey in Hollywood that you wanted to be able to include specifically and just the overall process and like, bringing My Place in the Sun for everyone to read?
Well, I guess the timing, if not now, when? I better get it done. And the COVID gave me an opportunity to complete it. It's called My Place in the Sun, obviously a reference to my father's film,
Mhm.
Life in the Golden Age of Hollywood and Washington. And I I'd made notes through the years. I in my Washington period part of my life, I worked with 7 presidents, um, doing the Kennedy Center honors and Christmas in Washington, and campaigning for a few of them. Um, and I just felt I had a story to tell,
Mhm.
and I'm so pleased that people kind of find the stories interesting.
Yeah.
And also, I worked with so many people of quality and human value, like Sidney, um, but President Kennedy and Edward R. Murrow, and just so many people who influenced my life, and so I tell those stories, and including the story of my own family. My
Mhm.
great grandmother was named Georgia Woodthorpe, born in San Francisco. And she entered the stage in San Francisco when she was 8 years old, I think around 1870.
Wow.
And she became a fine actress. And she is known to be the youngest Ophelia to the great Edwin Booth, our greatest Hamlet, to Edwin Booth's Hamlet. And
Mhm.
uh, and she started 5 generations of Stevensons in show business. So I have
Wow.
an opportunity to talk about my grandparents and my father, who was such an influence not only on me, but he was a fine filmmaker, a good citizen, a, a brave man at war. Um, anyway, I had a story to tell, so I wrote it down.
I love it. I love it. And
And
lastly,
also, for those of you who like audiobooks, I've recorded it so you can either read it or listen to it.
that's no excuse. So that means as you're working out, as you're going for a walk, as you just, like waking up in the morning doing work, you can listen to it anytime you want to.
Uh,
Yes. And lastly, I wanted to talk about kind of a little bit of what you said about the fact that just the amount of presidents that you've worked with, the amount of in the
uh,
Kennedy Center honors, et cetera, et cetera. And you really are one of the architects for a lot of the tie-ins that we have between, like public service and the arts, film, TV, on like this, government, adjacent type of level. Why do you think it's so important to have this appreciation for the art, specifically cinema, on this level? Because I feel like there's a world where one, it's not there may be like the separation between like arts and public service and the government. We also think about times where it's not been so well, thinking of Birth of a Nation screening at the White House and things like that as a period of time where there was like a connection between government and the arts and public service and the arts, and it really wasn't where it needed to be. So for you, what's the importance to have like on a national scale an appreciation for cinema and having so many important parties be involved in that, and things such as AFI, things such as Kennedy Center Honors, to be able to tribute these works?
I had a change of life. I was working with my father on the Diary of Anne Frank, and we were going to go forward. I would work with him on the greatest story ever told. When Edward R. Murrow came into my life, Edward R. Murrow was a great figure in World War II. He was the voice from London telling about the war. He was a great newsman at CBS. And he had gone to work for President Kennedy. They had the United States Information Agency, which was
Mhm.
charged with telling America's story abroad. And he asked me to come back and run the motion picture division of the United States Information Agency. And after saying no, because I felt obliged to stick with my father going into this big film, and my father heard that I'd had that offer, and he looked at me and he said, "I think you may have to do it." And he saw an opportunity for me. I never felt I was under his shadow, but he
Mhm.
was a, a pretty surpassing director. And it gave me this opportunity to go to Washington and to work with Murrow and President Kennedy. And Doris Goodwin has come out with a book you may have heard of about her and her husband, Richard Goodwin, who was a
Mhm.
contemporary of mine. He was
Mhm.
working at the White House when I was at USIA. and that we were part of something bigger than ourselves. And it was ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And to answer that question kind of in the affirmative, and then find out how great it is, how inspiring it is, what great fun it is. President Kennedy had wonderful quotations and way with words. And I remember him, he used to, Edith Hamilton wrote about the Greek poets. And President Kennedy quoted the Greek definition of happiness, which they said was the fullest use of one's powers along lines of excellence. And to be working in the government, making, gosh, we made 300 documentaries a year, and a lot of them were very good. And the feeling you were really serving a purpose, and you were enjoying that happiness, and just the influence of President Kennedy and Bobby, who became a close friend, and get a sense of social justice,
Yeah.
and humor and brightness, and it was such a great era, and that led me in more directions than I would have gone in, I think, if I had have stayed and concentrated on just a career in Hollywood.
Yes, yes. And I think it was a fulfilling career as well. And just thinking about how many people can look to your career as far as, like, because sometimes people think that, they can't, there's a term that I saw over the past years, and it's called activist filmmaking. And people think that, like, sometimes that can't be injected into the work that they do, and that can't be this fulfilling work. But as you said, your father said, being able to look at something and be like, okay, I can only imagine what the reception of this will be, or how the impact of this will be years down the road. And I think that's something that's fulfilling about the work that you do, and it's the reason why these years later, after Separate but Equal, we're taking a look back at that now, and seeing what it did, and it being kind of like that the cinema piece to Brown versus Board of Education, and us having this miniseries to revisit at a time right now. And we're revisiting at a time where it's more important than ever to revisit something like this.
Yes, and I think people will find, seeing how Earl Warren led a court of divided people, and led them to a unanimous decision. And one of the most reluctant justices was Harry Reid, more conservative,
Mhm.
and he finally is the last one, and Justice Warren goes to him, and he said, "Well, I'm going to go along with you." He says, "But there's going to be chaos. There's going to be division," and he recited what lay ahead, but
Mhm.
he had found a way to make what he knew was the right decision. Um, so, I think for people to see the Supreme Court operating the way that court operated is also a healthy diet for the present.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Stevens, for this conversation with the Writers Guild Foundation. And as we said earlier in this conversation, the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education is being commemorated with this new home release, wherever you can purchase DVDs or home releases. Be sure to check that out. But thank you so much for this conversation.
And Trey Mangum, thank you for your thoughtful questions and being such a good host.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you.